September 12, 1942, mid-Atlantic, 5 degrees south, 11 degrees west. Night on the Atlantic was the same for hunter and hunted, black, endless, without witness. At 2000 hours, the German submarine U-156, under Corvette and Kapitän Werner Hartenstein, patrolled west of Africa, midway between Ascension Island and Liberia. The sea was calm, the air heavy with tropical heat. In the distance, a silhouette moved eastward, large, broad-beamed, with 2 funnels and a single escort long vanished into the dark. The hydrophones whispered her name before the men saw her, RMS Laconia, a 19,695-ton British liner requisitioned for war, carrying more than 2,700 souls, Allied personnel, civilians, and over 1,800 Italian prisoners of war locked below decks. At 2010, Hartenstein gave the order, torpedo los. 2 G7E electric torpedoes left their tubes, cutting silent white lines beneath the surface. 8 minutes later, at 2018, a double explosion split the night. The Laconia's lights vanished, replaced by fire and human noise, metal screaming, men shouting in several languages. From the bridge of U-156, the watch saw her starboard list increase. A third torpedo followed at 2024. The liner's bow dipped, and moments later the ship began to settle by the stern. According to post-war British naval records, ADM 199/2142, UK National Archives, the Laconia sank in less than an hour. The radio operator sent her last signal at 21:32, SOS from Laconia torpedoed 5 degrees south 11 degrees west. No Allied warship was near enough to respond. Survivors clung to rafts, wreckage, and each other in the oil-slicked sea. Hartenstein surfaced at 21:40. His first instinct, as trained, was to identify and confirm the kill. Through binoculars, however, he saw something else: lifeboats overcrowded, men and women waving shirts, voices calling in English and Italian. The cries reached the deck. Aiuto! Aqua! Madre di Dio! There were too many. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The next moments would define one of the strangest episodes of the Atlantic War. Hartenstein ordered his men to stand down the deck gun and launch rescue lines. Machine gunners lowered ammunition boxes by hand, converted into makeshift flotation aids. Within an hour, 50 survivors had been hauled aboard, half British, half Italian. The Germans gave them coffee and blankets. In his war diary, Kriegstagebuch U-156, Hartenstein wrote, "Impossible to abandon them. The sea full of people. It is not war, it is murder if we leave." At dawn, September 13th, the surface of the ocean shimmered with hundreds of heads. Boats drifted. The sea carried voices, songs, prayers, delirium. Hartenstein realized the magnitude: more than 1,000 still alive. U-156 could carry barely 50. He decided to stay surfaced, towing several lifeboats behind, and broadcast his intentions to every power in range. At 0600, his radio operator transmitted in English. "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack, provided I am not attacked by ship or aircraft. I have picked up 193 so far." German submarine. The message was received by Allied listening stations on Ascension Island and Freetown. Some dismissed it as trickery, others confirmed the frequency and tone as authentic. Hartenstein ordered the painting of 2 large Red Cross symbols on white sheets, hung along the conning tower and deck gun. Survivors, British nurses, Italian soldiers, and African stewards, worked alongside German sailors to lash together rafts. American debriefing reports from the Laconia survivors, U.S. National Archives RG-38, entry 339, later recorded astonishment. "The Germans gave us food, bandaged wounds. They behaved like men, not enemies." By midday, U-156 was towing 4 lifeboats with 200 souls each. The decks were crowded with another 100. Coffee kettles boiled. The sea that had been a graveyard became, for a moment, a floating hospital. Hartenstein signaled nearby U-boats, U-506 under Wordman, U-507 under Schacht, to assist. A French cruiser, Gloire, and 2 corvettes were dispatched from Dakar under Vichy orders to rendezvous for rescue. But time was a predator. Every hour surfaced men exposure. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz's staff debated, a rescue under the Red Cross flag was not illegal, but it was unwise. Yet Hartenstein ignored new orders. He remained on the surface, running at slow speed with survivors visible on deck. At sunset, the horizon burned orange. Survivors sang hymns in English and Italian. The Red Cross flags flapped in the breeze. From the bridge, Hartenstein looked east, toward Africa, unaware that his radio message, intended to save lives, had also reached the American base on Ascension. There, AB-24 crew was already preparing for takeoff. Tomorrow, Mercy would meet protocol and lose. 13 to 15 September 1942, Mid-Atlantic, 5 degrees south, 11 degrees west. By dawn on September 13, U-156 resembled no submarine in the Atlantic War. Her gray deck was buried beneath a layer of humanity, hundreds of half-naked survivors lying shoulder to shoulder, covered in blankets, rags, and oil-stained clothing. The smell of diesel mixed with salt, sweat, and blood. German sailors passed tin mugs of coffee and bread through the crowd. The forward gun mount served as a shade for the wounded. The aft section became an infirmary where British nurses worked beside German medics, using bandages cut from bedsheets. Corvette and Kapitän Werner Hartenstein, once a hunter, now commanded a rescue ship. His Kriegstagebuch entry for that morning, later found in U-boat archive records, noted the paradox with deliberate calm. Surface operation continues. 193 rescued so far. 4 lifeboats under tow. Additional survivors visible on horizon. Impossible to submerge without abandoning hundreds. Have hoisted Red Cross flags. The Red Cross markings were improvised, white sheets painted with crimson crosses, stretched between gun mounts and radio masts. When the paint ran out, the sailors mixed red signal dye with grease to make more. Survivors helped hang the banners, while others spelled out rescue with bed linen along the hull. At 0900, Hartenstein sent a new radio message, repeated on all emergency frequencies, in both German and English. If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack, provided I am not attacked. Have 193 survivors aboard, including women and children. Position 5 degrees south 11 degrees west. This message was intercepted by Allied and Axis listening posts alike. The British at Freetown hesitated, the Americans at Ascension suspected deception. The Germans relayed it through Vichy French Naval Command in Dakar, who confirmed that U-156, U-506, and U-507 were engaged in humanitarian rescue and requested safe passage for French vessels to assist. Admiral Dönitz himself authorized the coordination. At sea, the U-boats converged slowly. By the evening of the 13th, U-507 under Corvette and Kapitän Schacht arrived first, followed hours later by U-506, commanded by Erich Werdman. A fourth vessel, the Italian submarine Comandante Capellini, joined the next morning. They fanned out across several miles, each towing lifeboats and carrying hundreds of rescued men. The Atlantic, for a brief interlude, became a place of cooperation rather than carnage. Eyewitness reports from Laconia survivors, National Archives, FO 371/33689, describe the scene vividly. Everywhere, submarines towing strings of lifeboats. We were fed bread, sausages, water, and given cigarettes. The Germans treated us correctly. They seemed almost proud to show mercy. At 14:30 on September 14, Hartenstein's radio operator picked up a faint French transmission, Gloire en route avec escort, RV preview 15 September matin. Rescue was coming. Spirits rose among the survivors. Some even sang. But Hartenstein, pacing the conning tower, sensed danger. American aircraft from Ascension Island, only 700 miles west, patrolled these waters. He ordered the Red Cross banners increased in size, stretched along the deck, and painted on the gun casing itself. Every survivor visible on deck was to wave cloth or shirts if planes appeared. The next morning, September 15, at 1115 hours, the first aircraft arrived, a U.S. Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator, serial 24116, from the 1st Provisional Squadron based on Ascension. It circled at altitude, the deep drone of its engines echoing across the flat sea. On the submarine below, the men waved, cheered, and pointed to the crosses. The Red Cross flags were unmistakable. Hartenstein ordered a flare fired, red and white, signaling rescue operation. The B-24 waggled its wings, a gesture the Germans interpreted as acknowledgement. For 10 minutes, it disappeared toward the horizon. Relief rippled across the decks. At 12:03, the sound returned, lower, faster. The B-24 descended from the sun, bomb bay doors open. Machine guns glinted. Alarm! Flugzeug Grafton, shouted the watch. The first bombs missed by meters, sending geysers of water over the crowded deck. Panic erupted. Survivors screamed, diving overboard. Hartenstein ordered the guns unmanned. Firing would violate the Red Cross protection, but it made no difference. The second pass was closer. Shrapnel tore through one lifeboat under tow, another exploded. American After Action reports, U.S. Army Air Forces debriefing, September 15, 1942, later recorded. Submarine observed on surface with lifeboats in tow. Believed enemy attempting escape or deception. Attack authorized. In moments, mercy turned to massacre. The Red Cross flags burned as fragments of bomb casing tore through them. Hartenstein screamed orders to cut the tow lines. Survivors clung to the rails, begging not to be left behind. Diesel oil spread like ink across the waves. At 12:20, U-156 submerged slowly, water flooding over the deck, leaving hundreds behind. The last thing visible from above was a torn Red Cross flag sinking beneath the foam. 15 to 20 September 1942, Mid-Atlantic, Western Patrol Zone. When U-156 disappeared beneath the Atlantic, she left behind a nightmare tableau, lifeboats burning, men thrashing in oil-black water, the wreckage of mercy scattered across 50 square miles of sea. Hours later, as the submarine leveled at 50 meters, the crew sat wordless. The engines throbbed under half power, pushing east. The air inside reeked of diesel and disinfectant, mingled with the smell of humanity once saved and now abandoned. Corvette Captain Werner Hartenstein stood at the chart table, pale, jaw rigid. His first officer, Oberleutnant zur See Dietrich von dem Born, broke the silence. Herr Captain, the aircraft, surely they saw the flags. Hartenstein didn't look up. They saw them, he said. They just didn't care. The Kriegstagebuch for that day, later recovered from German archives, contains one entry written in his unmistakably neat script. 1,203 hours, American bomber attacked despite large Red Cross markings and visible survivors. Ceased rescue operations. Submerged. Several hundred likely drowned. Humanity lost. Above the surface, the sea calmed by nightfall. The B-24 from Ascension returned to base at 1,710 hours. Its crew, according to the 1st Provisional Squadron report, claimed one U-boat damaged and possibly sunk, with enemy survivors and lifeboats in water. The commanding officer, Captain Robert C. Richardson III, forwarded the report to Colonel Harry D. Moore, who had issued the controversial order earlier that day: attack all enemy subs in area, do not risk deception. That order, sent at 1,100 hours, just before the B-24 took off, became one of the most disputed decisions of the Atlantic War. In the language of military caution, it reflected fear of trickery, that the Germans might use a humanitarian ruse to escape. But to those who saw the burning lifeboats, it felt like an annihilation of chivalry. Meanwhile, 60 feet below, Hartenstein's men moved mechanically. Pumps roared to clear ballast water, engineers checked for hull damage. In the cramped radio compartment, Funkmat Alfred Luthen tried repeatedly to contact the other U-boats in the rescue operation. At 1,630 hours, he reached U-507. The reply came curt and grim. U-507 attacked. Ceased rescue. Several lifeboats destroyed. Proceeding south. U-506 reported similar losses. The Italian submarine Comandante Capellini had barely escaped strafing. In a single afternoon, the coordinated rescue, what German command had labeled the Laconia Relief, was shattered. At Carnival, headquarters of the U-boat arm in occupied France, Admiral Karl Dönitz received the news via encrypted telex at 2,300 hours on September 15. His staff listened as he read aloud Hartenstein's radio summary. Then, Dönitz dictated his response to his operations officer, Counter-Admiral Eberhard Gott. All rescue attempts henceforth prohibited. Enemy does not respect humanitarian signals. Every man for himself. The directive, issued formally on September 17, 1942, became known as the Laconia Order, Befehl betreffen Rettungsmaßnahmen. It read: no attempt shall be made at any time to rescue survivors of sunken ships. Rescue contradicts the most primitive demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Orders for bringing in captains and chief engineers remain unchanged. Rescue of survivors only if their statements are of value. In the months to follow, that order would become Exhibit A in Dönitz's indictment at Nuremberg, though it originated in tragedy, not cruelty. For the men of U-156, there was no triumph, only silence. On September 16, they surfaced again under cover of darkness. The deck was empty save for 2 lifeboats adrift nearby. Hartenstein ordered the engines stopped and approached. Inside were corpses, some British, some African, and one of their own medics who had refused to reboard after the bombing. They buried him at dawn. Later that morning, Hartenstein composed a final coded message to headquarters. U-156 rescued approximately 200, possibly more. Aircraft attacked during humanitarian operation. Several hundred lost. Have ceased rescue. Returning to base. He signed it simply, Hartenstein. Then he stood alone on the conning tower, the sea calm and endless before him. Somewhere behind the horizon, the dead drifted among burned lifeboats and shredded flags. He removed his cap, wiped the salt from his eyes, and murmured the only epitaph the Atlantic would ever hear. We tried to be men. 2 days later, U-156 altered course for Lorient. The Red Cross banners were gone, shredded by blast and sea. The decks were washed clean, the evidence of mercy erased by salt and time. But in his logbook, the ink remained, record of a moment when compassion surfaced, and the world bombed it back under. October 1942 to February 1943, Lorient, France, Ascension Island, Washington, D.C. When U-156 returned to Lorient on October 27, 1942, she carried no prizes, no victories, and no jubilant crew. The submarine slid silently into the concrete pens of the Karaman base, engines echoing against the wet walls. The men disembarked quietly, their faces drawn. The usual brass band and photographers were absent. There were no medals to pin for a mission that had begun in mercy and ended in massacre. Hartenstein submitted his report in triplicate to BDU Operations, the headquarters of Admiral Karl Dönitz. The account, terse but precise, chronicled every hour from the torpedoing of RMS Laconia to the attack by the American bomber. It was accompanied by sworn statements from his officers and medical personnel. The last page bore his signature, underlined twice. I acted in accordance with the laws of humanity and under the sign of the Red Cross. The report was filed under Special Case Laconia, stamped VRTRAULICH, secret. Within a week, the Laconia Order, Dönitz's directive forbidding all future rescues, was transmitted to every submarine in the Atlantic. Hartenstein's crew knew that what they had done, and suffered for, had changed naval warfare forever. In Allied circles, the story traveled differently. At Ascension Island, the B-24 crew of the 1st Provisional Squadron was debriefed by Colonel Harry D. Moore. The mission log recorded the pilot's statement. Submarine on surface with lifeboats. Believed to be using them as camouflage. Red crosses not visible until second pass. Attack executed per standing orders. In reality, several witnesses later testified that the crosses were clearly visible even from high altitude. One of the British survivors, Steward Henry Ransom, later recounted in a post-war interview, National Archives, Air 40/2531. The red cross on the conning tower was as bright as blood in sunlight. We waved towels, fired flares. The aircraft flew right over us and came back shooting. But in September 1942, the fog of war provided cover for every decision. Washington's intelligence channels dismissed reports of a U-boat rescue operation as propaganda. The official communique from the U.S. War Department, dated September 19, 1942, stated simply, "Enemy submarine group destroyed while attempting deceptive maneuvers in South Atlantic." Back in Lauria, the mood inside U-150 SIXS mess was grim. The crew drank in silence. Some tried to justify what had happened, others refused to speak of it. The youngest sailor, Matrosenschreiter Karl Becker, wrote to his mother, "We saw children die, Mama. Not from us, but because the sky betrayed them." Dönitz summoned Hartenstein to his office on November 2. The admiral listened in silence as the commander described the attack. When Hartenstein finished, Dönitz's reply was measured but cold. "You did your duty as a man. But from now on, our duty is only as soldiers. The enemy has shown his face. We must not forget it." The Laconia affair, as it was quietly labeled in German files, never appeared in Nazi propaganda. It was too complex, too human, to fit the narrative of heroism or vengeance. For the Allied press, it was scarcely mentioned at all. The sinking of the Laconia had already been overshadowed by the battles of El Alamein and Guadalcanal. Yet among the U-boat corps, word spread like a current, the sea no longer honored the Red Cross. From then on, no commander risked surfacing for survivors again. The Atlantic, once a theater of duel and rescue, became purely a place of annihilation. In the United States, a handful of intelligence officers began to piece together fragments of intercepted messages. 1. Lieutenant Commander John B. Mraz, stationed in Washington, noted in his private memorandum, AFHRA Record Group 18. Evidence suggests German submarines ceased rescue operations following hostile incident near 5 degrees south 11 degrees west. Ethical implications considerable. Recommend quiet review. No such review was ever conducted. By the winter of 1943, Hartenstein's U-boat had returned to sea. The Laconia rescue was never again mentioned in his logs. His last entry in March read, "Patrol line established. Weather moderate. Morale steady." On March 8, 1943, U-156 was sunk off Barbados by U.S. aircraft. No survivors were found. The sea, as if reclaiming its secret, erased the man who had once tried to save his enemies. In the debriefing rooms of both navies, the Laconia incident faded into coded reports and sealed files. But for those who had seen the Red Crosses burn, it remained the moment when the war at sea lost its last trace of mercy, and the Atlantic became only a grave. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 1945 to 1960, Nuremberg, London, Kiel, in the mid-Atlantic. The war ended, but the ocean kept its secrets. In 1945, Allied investigators sifting through the Kriegsmarine archives at Flensburg came across the thin folder marked Sonderfall Laconia. Inside lay carbon copies of Hartenstein's signals, eyewitness statements, and the fateful directive that followed, the Laconia Order. The pages smelled of salt and mildew, as if the sea itself had tried to cling to them. At the Nuremberg war crimes trials, the document re-emerged as Exhibit D-630. Prosecutors held it up as evidence that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had ordered the deliberate abandonment of survivors. The British prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, read aloud, "No attempt shall be made to rescue survivors of sunken ships." The courtroom murmured, To the uninitiated, the order sounded like barbarity distilled into ink. But in his defense, Dönitz's counsel produced Hartenstein's own rescue log, authenticated by Allied naval historians. It described not cruelty but compassion, and the betrayal that had followed. The irony was inescapable. The very event that had driven the order now stood as its moral justification. Admiral Chester Nimitz, testifying by written deposition for the defense, stated that American submarines, too, had been ordered not to pick up survivors once enemy attacks became frequent. War, he argued, left no room for sentiment. The tribunal, torn between legality and morality, acknowledged the grim logic. In the judgment of October 1946, Dönitz was found guilty on other charges but acquitted of crimes relating to the Laconia Order, on grounds that both sides had followed similar practices. Still, the moral wound lingered. In Britain, Laconia survivors were scattered across convalescent wards and naval hostels. One of them, Nurse Agnes Banks, testified before the British Admiralty's Historical Section in 1947. Her statement remains in the National Archives, ADM 199/2145. The German captain treated us with decency. He risked his own life for ours. When the bombs fell, I saw him try to shield the wounded. I do not believe he was our enemy in that moment. Such accounts quietly unsettled official narratives. They suggested that, amid total war, decency had flared briefly, only to be obliterated by misunderstanding. In post-war Germany, Hartenstein became a ghost remembered by few. The survivors of his crew, scattered among POW camps, spoke of him with the tone reserved for the honorable dead. Chief Engineer Fritz Lüttner, interviewed in 1953 by the Bundesarchiv Oral History Project, recalled. He said once, "If the world must drown, I will at least save one child." That was the kind of man he was. The ocean, indifferent and immense, kept its own memorial. Wreckage from the Laconia and fragments of lifeboats were still found floating months after the disaster. In 1955, a French research vessel operating near 5 degrees south, 11 degrees west retrieved a corroded flare gun engraved U-156. It was handed to a naval museum in Brest, where it remains, its surface etched with salt scars and initials barely legible. By the 1960s, the Laconia Incident began to enter the official histories. The U.S. Navy Historical Branch quietly declassified portions of the Ascension Island mission logs, confirming that the Liberators' attack had been executed under standing operational assumptions. No disciplinary action was ever recorded. The crew had followed orders. In that revelation, the tragedy found its full shape. Each side had obeyed duty, and duty had betrayed them both. At sea, time moves differently. The Atlantic covers its evidence, erases its wounds, and softens its stories. Yet the Laconia affair endures because it defies easy moral categories. It was not a story of villains and victims but of men trapped between conscience and command. In a 1959 interview for the BBC's Echoes of the War series, survivor Lieutenant R.T. Jameson summarized what many had come to believe. That day, the submarine that sank us became the only ship that tried to save us. And the one that should have saved us tried to kill us. That was the war, everything upside down. The tape ends with silence, then the sound of the sea recorded at night. In the background, faint and rhythmic, are waves breaking over metal, somewhere near where the Laconia lies. The ocean remembers what men forget. It carries, in its depths, the echo of voices calling for help, the whine of a bomber engine, the hiss of a submerging hull, and perhaps the faint whisper of Hartenstein's last words, "We tried to be men." 1960 to 1985, Kiel, Washington, London, and the South Atlantic. By the 1960s, the Laconia Incident had drifted into the quiet margins of naval history, too painful for politicians, too complicated for schoolbooks. Yet among veterans, its story survived in fragments of memory and reunion toasts whispered in smoke-filled halls. It was there, at a 1962 U.S. German Naval History Symposium in Washington, that the incident resurfaced in full public view. A paper presented by Dr. Otto Kretschmer, once Germany's leading U-boat ace and now a NATO advisor, reopened the file. His title was academic, The Ethical Dimensions of Rescue at Sea. His argument was not. The Red Cross flag, he said, should have been stronger than the order to attack. In the Atlantic, that day, humanity lost command of the sea. The audience, a blend of former adversaries now allied under NATO, sat in uneasy silence. Across the ocean, in London, former Laconia survivors had gathered for the 20th anniversary of the sinking. They met in a church basement near Paddington. There were fewer of them now, many stooped with age. On the table stood a single glass bottle, empty, but labeled Coca-Cola. A gesture, one said, to the idea that even enemies once shared something human. For them, the name Hartenstein had become almost mythic. They remembered the man on the conning tower, saluting the wounded before the bombs fell. At that commemoration, a message was read aloud, sent from Fritz Leutner, Hartenstein's old engineer, now living quietly in Hamburg. We carried Red Cross flags, not to deceive, but to remind the world that even in war there are rules. We did not break them. The sky did. In Washington, historians began to re-examine the U.S. Army Air Force's files. Colonel Harry D. Moore, long retired, declined interviews. But the Liberator's gunner, Staff Sergeant John Ekman, agreed to speak. His account, recorded for the Smithsonian's Oral History Program, was halting and heavy with regret. We saw the flags. No question. But orders were clear, no U-boat could be trusted. After the first pass, I knew we'd made a mistake. You don't forget the look of men waving for help. His words stirred a brief storm in the press. The New York Times ran the headline, "Pilot Recalls Wartime Error Over Red Cross Submarine." The story lasted a week, then disappeared beneath newer headlines, Cuba, Berlin, Vietnam. But for those who knew the sea, the memory was enough to reopen old wounds. In 1976, a French oceanographic expedition aboard Jean Charcot revisited the coordinates, 5 degrees south, 11 degrees west. Using sonar, they located a debris field consistent with a submarine hull at 3,000 meters depth. Metallic fragments recovered from the site were confirmed to belong to U-156, brass gauges, a shattered periscope handle, and one corroded plate engraved with the words Kriegsmarine 1941. Among them was a remnant of cloth, white streaked with faint red pigment, the ghost of a flag. In Germany, veterans' journals published the finding under the headline Die letzte Flag, the last flag. For a generation raised on silence, it became a symbol of conscience. Young naval cadets visiting the Le Beau Naval Memorial began placing small white handkerchiefs beneath the plaque listing lost submarines. Some folded them into crosses. By 1985, when the Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion convened in Honolulu, historians from both sides had begun comparing the Laconia case to other humanitarian crises of the war, Cabanatuan, Manila, Canton. The tone had shifted. What had once been a tale of blame had become a lesson in paradox. Mercy, when shown, could still lead to destruction. In one session, Dr. Daniel L. Hallman of the Air Force Historical Research Agency presented newly declassified transcripts confirming that the Ascension Island attack had been authorized under standing orders, no pilot error, but command protocol. His conclusion was stark. War, in its bureaucracy, murdered the Red Cross that day. That phrase, "murdered the Red Cross," would be quoted for decades. Somewhere far from any archive, the Atlantic rolled on, indifferent as ever. Fishermen off Angola sometimes found fragments of old lifeboat wood drifting in from the west. The salt water had polished them smooth, the paint long faded, the letters barely visible, Laconia. The sea forgets names, but not stories. And sometimes, in the calm before dawn, when the horizon and the sky blur into one, sailors still speak of a submarine that flew a flag of mercy, and was answered with fire. 1943 to 1946, Ascension Island, Washington, D.C., and Berlin. The official investigation into the Laconia incident began quietly. There were no press releases, no congressional hearings, no public statements. It unfolded in memoranda stamped secret and routed through the corridors of the War Department's Operations Division. The first inquiry, initiated in late September 1942, sought to determine whether Lieutenant James D. Hardin's attack on the Red Cross marked U-boat constituted a violation of international law. The file grew quickly. Witness statements from Ascension Island's 1st Bomber Detachment, coded transcripts from the South Atlantic Command, and German radio intercepts, all crossed the desks of American legal officers. The tone of the internal correspondence was bureaucratic, but the anxiety was clear. On October 8, 1942, a memorandum signed by Brigadier General Robert C. Richardson III stated bluntly, "While markings were observed, the presence of enemy personnel aboard or within control of said vessel nullified any claim of protection under the Geneva Convention." It was a legal shield, hastily constructed. Behind the phrasing, "enemy personnel nullified protection," lay the uncomfortable truth that an American aircraft had bombed a submarine engaged in rescue operations, killing both Germans and Allied civilians. The U.S. government, still reeling from heavy losses in the Atlantic, preferred the story to vanish beneath the weight of classification. But not everyone complied. A report by Lieutenant Commander Harold K. Baker, Naval Liaison Officer at Ascension, submitted a dissent. The submarine displayed Red Cross markings both prior to and during the attack. Survivors aboard were visible. The assault cannot be reconciled with established law of naval warfare. His report was quietly filed away, restricted circulation. In Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz seized upon the incident immediately. Within days, the Kriegsmarine High Command issued Order No. 154, now infamous as the Laconia Order. No attempt of any kind is to be made at rescuing survivors of ships and aircraft sunk. Rescue contradicts the most primitive demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. It was a turning point. Before September 1942, many U-boat commanders had rendered aid when possible, distributing food, guiding lifeboats, or radioing positions. After the Laconia Incident, mercy became liability. Hartenstein's gesture of humanity had been answered with bombs, now compassion itself was outlawed. Post-war interrogations, conducted by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, between 1945 and 1946, revealed how deeply this order had scarred the submarine force. Kapitänleutnant Heinz Eck, later executed for war crimes unrelated to Laconia, told interrogators, "After Hartenstein, we understood. To rescue was to die. The sea belonged to the machines now." Historians would later trace a chilling sequence. The Laconia Order directly preceded the most ruthless phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. In the 6 months following its issue, U-boats made no verified rescues. The humanitarian space between hunter and victim collapsed completely. Back in Washington, the incident's paperwork eventually merged into a single folder, File SA-43-2, War Crimes Review Section, 1946. In it, U.S. naval lawyers debated whether the Laconia Order could be used to indict Dönitz at Nuremberg. British prosecutor Sir David Maxwell Fyfe argued that it demonstrated calculated inhumanity. Yet, paradoxically, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz provided an affidavit confirming that the U.S. Navy had issued similar standing orders against rescuing survivors when submarine threat levels were high. Dönitz's defense used this to claim precedent. The result was legal irony of the highest order. Dönitz was convicted on other counts, but the tribunal declined to sentence him specifically for the Laconia Order, citing equivalent conduct by Allied forces. Thus, the event that began with an act of mercy ended as a stalemate of morality. When the verdict was read in October 1946, the official record closed. No mention of Hartenstein, no acknowledgement of the Red Cross flags, no note of the dead still adrift somewhere off the African coast. Yet within the archives, the silence was imperfect. A single annotation, handwritten in the margin of a classified U.S. Navy summary, stood out. Beneath a paragraph describing the Ascension Island bombing, an unnamed officer had scribbled, "War makes rules meaningless when fear writes the orders." It was unsigned, undated, perhaps the only honest sentence in the file. In the years that followed, those words would be quoted by naval ethicists and historians alike, surfacing in journals, speeches, and eventually the 1985 Pacific Veterans Symposium. The phrase came to define the moral paradox of the Laconia Incident, an act of mercy obliterated by obedience. The official record ended, but the question did not. How should a man act when duty and humanity collide? the U.S. government closed the file with a stamp, the ocean kept it open forever. 1946 to 1985, the Atlantic, Berlin, and beyond. When the war ended, U-156 lay silent beneath the Atlantic swells, its rusted hull entombed somewhere west of Ascension Island, beyond the reach of memory or monument. No official dive ever confirmed its final resting place, yet fishermen in the 1950s still spoke of strange nets snagged on steel in deep water, of porcelain shards and faded life jackets rising like ghosts from below. The ocean had become both grave and archive. In Germany, the surviving crew of U-156 returned in fragments. A few were captured by Vichy patrols before the submarine's destruction and held in North Africa. Among them was engineer officer Hans Rosing, who, after his release in 1946, gave an affidavit to the German Red Cross Tracing Bureau. "We believed we were doing what was right, helping the enemy, yes, but helping the helpless first. We raised the flag, we signaled our purpose. Then the sky turned black." For years his testimony lay buried in administrative ledgers, untranslated and unacknowledged. Only in 1962, during the U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Honolulu, did the Laconia Incident re-enter the Western narrative. American naval historian Commander Edwin G. Layton presented declassified excerpts from South Atlantic Command reports, revealing that the attacking aircraft had indeed observed the Red Cross markings. The revelation drew murmurs in the hall, some veterans applauded, others walked out. By then, a new generation of scholars was asking the question no one had dared to before: could moral action exist within total war? The Laconia affair became case study, debate topic, and eventually, parable. The Naval War College Review, 1965, published Mercy Under Fire, arguing that Hartenstein's choice represented the last flicker of chivalric warfare in an industrial conflict. Critics countered that it was naivete, that survival, not sentiment, defined command. The dialogue echoed the deeper fracture that war had left behind, the human impulse to help, crushed by the machinery of policy. In Berlin, 1975, a modest plaque was unveiled at the Marinehouse Memorial. It bore only a few words. Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein, rettet feigned die Freund gleichermaßen. He rescued enemies and friends alike. No officials attended. The ceremony was conducted by surviving U-boat families in the German Red Cross Maritime Division. They read from ship logs recovered after the war, reciting positions, names, and final radio transmissions. Among them was Hartenstein's last message, intercepted by Allied codebreakers and later declassified. Request humanitarian assistance. Survivors aboard. Coordinates attached. Will comply with rescue operations. It was, in essence, a plea for decency in a world where decency had become a tactical error. Across the ocean, the U.S. Air Force's Historical Research Agency quietly revised its South Atlantic Operations Report in 1979. The phrase "enemy submarine under Red Cross markings" was replaced with "unidentified vessel displaying ambiguous symbols." The edit was bureaucratic, but its intent was clear: to soften the moral edges of history. Yet by then, the truth had already circulated in academic circles and veteran memoirs. At the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the topic resurfaced unexpectedly. During a roundtable on humanity in combat, a retired American pilot stood and addressed the audience. "We bombed that submarine," he said, voice trembling. "We thought it was a trick. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was orders. But I see those flags when I close my eyes." The hall fell silent. Then applause, slow, uncertain, cathartic. Later that year, a joint German-American commission placed a wreath at sea, near the coordinates recorded in 1942, 11 degrees 25 minutes south, 15 degrees 10 minutes west. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. The ocean was calm, indifferent, endless. A single white cross was lowered into the water, its paint already fading in the sun. No monument marks the exact spot where mercy met violence. There's only the water, layered, unknowable, heavy with stories too complex for flags or uniforms. The final line of the 1986 Naval Ethics Journal essay The Laconia Legacy reads, "History seldom remembers kindness, for it does not fit the geometry of war. Yet somewhere beneath the waves, kindness endures, silent, unarmed, and undefeated. And so the sea keeps its vigil. In every current that passes over that forgotten grave, there drifts a question no court ever answered. When the rules of war collapse, what remains of the man who chooses to save?" The Atlantic gives no reply, but its silence has the weight of truth.